The courtroom buzzed with quiet murmurs as people settled into their seats, unaware that they were about to witness a moment that would shake the very foundation of justice. Judge Raymond Calloway, a man known for his sharp tongue and even sharper judgments, leaned back in his chair, exuding the kind of confidence that comes from years of unchecked authority. He had seen thousands of defendants stand before him, each one powerless beneath his gavel. But today, he was in for a reckoning. At the center of the courtroom sat a man in a wheelchair, his hands resting calmly on the armrests, his face unreadable. James Carter was accused of fraud, an elaborate scheme involving financial documents, and as far as Judge Calloway was concerned, this case was already decided. A disabled man sitting quietly, not defending himself. Easy target. The judge barely concealed his disdain as he spoke, his words dripping with condescension. "Mr. Carter," he drawled, flipping through the case file with exaggerated boredom. "You expect this court to believe that you, a man who has allegedly scammed the system, are somehow the victim here?" He chuckled, shaking his head. "Spare me the performance." The courtroom rippled with discomfort, but no one spoke. The prosecutor smirked, certain that this was just another open and shut case. James, however, remained unmoved. His silence wasn't submission, it was patience. He met the judge's gaze without flinching, his expression revealing nothing. Judge Calloway sighed dramatically. "People like you take advantage of good, hard-working citizens," he continued, gesturing broadly as if to rally the room behind him. "You manipulate, you deceive, and then you sit there expecting mercy. But not today. Today, justice will be served." James exhaled slowly, his fingers tightening ever so slightly on the armrests of his wheelchair. Then, in a single fluid motion, he did what no one expected. He stood. The courtroom fell into absolute silence. The prosecutor's smirk disappeared. The stenographer stopped typing. A woman in the gallery gasped audibly. But the most telling reaction came from Judge Calloway. His face, once filled with smug certainty, drained of color. His fingers tensed against the bench, as if grasping for control that had just slipped through his fingers. James stepped forward, his movements steady, his voice calm yet commanding. "Your Honor," he said, reaching into his pocket, "perhaps it's time you take a closer look at who's really being judged here." He flipped open a leather-bound badge and held it up for all to see. "James Carter, Special Investigator, United States Department of Justice." The weight of his words crushed the air from the room. Judge Calloway's mouth opened, then closed, as realization dawned upon him. The man he had just mocked, belittled, and dismissed as a fraud was not just a defendant. He was an undercover investigator sent to expose corruption within the system. For the first time in his career, Judge Calloway had no words. The courtroom that had once belonged to him now belonged to the man he had underestimated. And in that moment, it became clear. This trial wasn't about James Carter at all. The real man on trial had just been revealed. The weight of the revelation hung in the air, pressing against every person in the courtroom. Judge Raymond Calloway, once so sure of his authority, now sat frozen, his grip tightening around the edge of his bench, as if it were the only thing keeping him upright. The man he had mocked, the man he had dismissed as just another fraudster, was now standing before him, not as a helpless defendant, but as a force of reckoning. The power dynamics in the room had shifted in an instant, and Calloway, for the first time in his career, found himself on the losing end. James Carter stood tall, his badge gleaming under the harsh fluorescent lights. His presence was no longer quiet, no longer something to be dismissed. He was not just here to clear his name. He was here for something much bigger. His voice, steady and deliberate, cut through the thick silence. "For years," he said, his gaze locked onto the judge, "men like you have sat in courtrooms like this, deciding the fates of people who never stood a chance, rushing through cases, silencing the ones who dare to fight back, bending the law not to serve justice, but to serve yourselves." The gallery, once filled with murmurs of amusement at Judge Calloway's arrogance, now hung onto every word, watching as the foundation of power beneath the judge crumbled. The prosecutor, who had moments ago stood with unwavering confidence, took an uneasy step back, his throat bobbing as he swallowed hard. Even the court officers, men who had spent years enforcing the judge's commands without question, now exchanged uncertain glances. Calloway's jaw tightened. His voice, when he finally found it, was hoarse, lacking the authority it once held. "This is ridiculous," he said, though the usual steel in his words had dulled. "You have no right." James stepped forward, his measured stride filled with the quiet authority of a man who knew he had already won. "No right?" he repeated, his tone sharper now. "I have every right, because I've been watching. I've seen the cases you've presided over. I've read the transcripts. I know about the backroom deals, the verdicts decided before a single argument was heard, the lives you've destroyed for your own gain." He let the words settle before adding, "And so does the Department of Justice." The judge's face twisted, his breath coming in uneven bursts. The room no longer belonged to him. He could feel the walls closing in, could hear the weight of his own mistakes creeping toward him like a storm he had never thought would come. The gavel, which once commanded absolute control, now sat useless before him. The trial had turned, and he was the one being judged. The sound of approaching footsteps echoed through the hallway outside, a new presence entering the scene. The doors burst open, and federal agents flooded the room, their badges raised, their purpose clear. The courtroom, once a place where Calloway dictated fate, had transformed into something else entirely. It was no longer a place for his power. It was a place where it would finally end. The weight of justice is not in the gavel that strikes the bench, nor in the heavy books of law that line courtroom walls. It is in the quiet, unshakable truth that refuses to stay buried. And in that moment, as Judge Calloway sat paralyzed in his chair, staring at the federal agents moving toward him, he finally understood what it meant to be powerless. James Carter had not raised his voice, had not pounded a fist on the table, had not met arrogance with rage. Instead, he had done something far more devastating. He had simply let the truth stand on its own. And the truth had done what truth always does when it is given the chance to breathe. It had turned the world upside down. The tension in the room was suffocating, thick with the kind of silence that only comes when something irrevocable has happened. Calloway's chest rose and fell in uneven breaths, his once imposing figure now shrunken under the crushing realization of what was about to unfold. His grip tightened on the edge of his bench, as if he could anchor himself to the power that had always protected him. But there was nothing left to hold on to. James did not look away as two agents stepped forward, their faces unreadable, their movements precise. The click of the handcuffs snapped through the room like a crack of thunder, final and absolute. Calloway flinched, but he did not fight. Perhaps he knew there was no fight left to win. His arrogance had been his shield, his weapon of choice in a courtroom where he had controlled the rules. But against justice, against truth, against the weight of his own corruption, arrogance was nothing but an empty shell. The courtroom was still, as if no one dared to move, afraid to break the spell that had bound them all in place. The jurors, who had been so hesitant before, so careful not to challenge the judge's authority, now watched with something close to disbelief. The prosecution, once brimming with confidence, now stood motionless, knowing that whatever victory they thought they had secured had just crumbled beneath them. James took one last look at the man who had spent years passing judgment without ever expecting to be judged himself. There was no satisfaction in his expression, no gloating in his posture. Because justice, when it is real, is not about revenge. It is about setting things right. As the agents led Calloway from the courtroom, a murmur rippled through the gallery, a sound that was not quite celebration, not quite relief, but something in between. A recognition that they had all witnessed something rare, power held accountable. James turned toward the exit, stepping past the bench where Calloway had once ruled with unchecked authority. The courtroom doors swung open before him, sunlight spilling in from the outside world. The air felt different now, lighter, freer. Justice had been served, not with force, not with fury, but with the quiet, unwavering power of truth. And for the first time in a long time, this courtroom, this town, and perhaps even the system itself, had taken a step towards something better. The weight of what had just transpired in that courtroom lingered long after the doors swung shut. The air still carried the echoes of a truth that had shattered illusions, a truth that had stood firm in the face of corruption. As James Carter stepped out into the open, the sunlight hit differently. It was not just another day. It was the start of something new. And yet, beneath the quiet victory, a question remained, lingering in the back of his mind like an unfinished sentence. How many others had sat where he sat? How many had walked into courtrooms, hopeful that justice would prevail, only to realize that the system was not built for them? The reality settled in his chest with the weight of something he had always known but never felt this deeply. Judge Calloway was not the first of his kind, and he would not be the last. His fall was monumental, a statement, a warning, but it was not the solution to the problem. There were still more walls to tear down, more veils to lift, more truths waiting to be spoken. James had seen what unchecked power looked like, how it draped itself in the robes of authority, and spoke in the language of the law while silencing those it was meant to protect. It was not just Calloway. It was the culture that allowed men like him to reign unchecked for years, confident that their judgment would never be questioned, their abuses never exposed. Calloway had believed himself untouchable because for too long he had been. And that, more than anything, was the real crime. The reporters outside the courthouse swarmed the steps, microphones poised, cameras rolling. Their faces were eager, their voices overlapping as they hurled questions at him. But James did not stop for them. His message was not for the headlines. It was for the people who had watched in silence, the ones who had known injustice but feared speaking against it, the ones who had walked into courtrooms expecting fairness and had left with a taste of betrayal on their tongues. He paused only for a moment, just enough for his voice to carry beyond the cameras, beyond the walls of this courthouse, beyond this one case. Justice is not real unless it is for everyone, he said, his voice steady. And the truth will only set us free if we are brave enough to speak it. Then he walked away. Behind him, the crowd murmured, the weight of his words settling in. Some would forget this moment, moving on as the news cycle shifted, but others would not. Some would remember what it felt like to see power fall, to see truth rise, to see a man who had been dismissed as insignificant stand taller than the very system that sought to silence him. James knew this was only the beginning. One battle had been won, but the war for justice was far from over. It would take more than one courtroom, one trial, one exposed corruption to change an entire system. But today, for the first time in a long time, he believed in the fight, because today, the truth had won. And if it could win here, it could win anywhere. The echoes of the courtroom still lingered in the air, not just within its walls, but beyond them, spilling into the streets, into conversations, into the very fabric of a justice system that had long shielded those who wielded power irresponsibly. What happened that day was more than the fall of a single corrupt judge. It was a moment of reckoning, a crack in the foundation of a system that had gone unchecked for far too long. But as James Carter walked away from that courthouse, he knew that one victory was not enough. It was never just about Calloway. It was about every other judge, every prosecutor, every official who had learned to treat justice as a privilege instead of a right. It was about the ones who had been silenced before they could even tell their story, the ones who never had their moment to stand up and reveal the truth. James had spent years believing in the justice system, trusting that fairness was more than just an idea. It was a reality. But that day he had seen the truth with his own eyes. He had seen how power, when left unchallenged, could twist the very principles it was meant to uphold. He had seen how a courtroom, a place meant to deliver justice, could instead become a stage for arrogance, for oppression, for the quiet suffocation of those who dared to speak against authority. Calloway had believed himself untouchable, and for years he had been. He had spoken with the confidence of a man who had never faced consequences. who had built a career on the assumption that no one would ever question his word. And that, James realized, was the true danger. Not just Calloway himself, but the system that had allowed him to thrive. But now, that illusion had been shattered. For the first time, the power dynamic had shifted, and the world had seen a different kind of justice, one that did not bow to status, one that did not falter in the face of intimidation. The truth had not only been spoken, it had been heard, and there was no going back from that. The cameras had captured everything. The people had witnessed it. The weight of that moment would not fade easily. Yet James knew that change did not come from one moment alone. This was not the end of the fight. If anything, it was the beginning. There were more voices that needed to be heard, more walls that needed to come down, more truths that needed to be told. What happened in that courtroom could not just be a story to be forgotten. It had to be a catalyst, a force that propelled others to stand up, to demand better, to refuse to accept injustice as an inevitable part of the system. As he stepped away from the courthouse, he felt the weight of responsibility settle over him. It was not enough to simply witness history. He had to be part of what came next. Because justice was not something that simply existed. It was something that had to be fought for, again and again, by those who refused to be silent. And James Carter had never been more certain that he would be one of them. The weight of injustice does not disappear when the verdict is read. It lingers, settling into the cracks of a system that has long failed those it was meant to protect. The conviction of Judge Calloway was a moment of reckoning, but it was not a resolution. It was not justice in its fullest form. It was merely the beginning of a larger truth unraveling. For years he had operated under the belief that his power was absolute, that no one would dare to challenge him. His word had been law, his decisions unquestioned. He had built his career on the assumption that the people before him, especially those who looked like James Carter, would never have the means to fight back. But that day, his certainty shattered, and as he was led out of his own courtroom in handcuffs, the world saw, perhaps for the first time, that power unchecked is never permanent. But James knew that one man's downfall would not erase the years of harm he had inflicted. It would not bring back the people he had sentenced unfairly, nor would it heal the wounds left by a system that had allowed him to reign without accountability. Justice, real justice, was not about the public spectacle of a corrupt official finally facing consequences. It was about what happened next. It was about the conversations that would unfold in its wake, the policies that would be questioned, the other judges who would realize that they were no longer above scrutiny. This was the moment when silence was no longer an option. James had spent most of his life believing in the justice system, trusting in its principles, its rules. But that trust had been broken, not just by Calloway, but by the realization that he was never supposed to have a chance in that courtroom. If the truth had not been revealed, if the weight of his real identity had not forced their hand, he would have been just another case, just another man who had been labeled guilty before he even spoke. That truth was the most painful part of it all, knowing that for so many others, the outcome had been different, that some had been buried under false convictions with no badge to save them, no hidden authority to pull them from the depths of a corrupt system. As he stepped out into the open air, feeling the sun on his skin, James did not feel victory. He felt the weight of responsibility. Because now, he had a choice. He could walk away, satisfied that he had won his own battle, or he could use what happened that day to fight for something greater. And he knew there was no real choice at all. Change was not something that happened in a single moment. It was something that had to be demanded, over and over again, by those who refused to accept the status quo. This was not the end of the fight. It was the beginning, and James Carter was ready for what came next. The world had changed in the hours since James Carter walked into that courtroom. The air felt different, charged with something unspoken, as if the very walls had absorbed the weight of what had transpired. Judge Calloway had fallen, his power stripped away in an instant, but the echoes of his rulings, the countless lives he had affected, still lingered. His removal was not the end of injustice, only proof that it could be confronted. The real question was, what came next? For James, the answer was clear. The system had been exposed, but exposure was not the same as transformation. What good was one conviction when others like Calloway remained seated at the bench, handing down rulings with the same arrogance, the same disregard for truth? Justice was not won by a single act. It was something that had to be rebuilt from the ground up. As he stepped outside, the sky stretched wide above him, but James felt no lightness, no relief. The people who had witnessed the trial, who had gasped as Calloway was led away, were still talking, still processing. Some were shaken, others emboldened. A few, no doubt, were angry, not because Calloway was corrupt, but because he had been caught. Power does not surrender easily, and James knew that for every moment of victory, there would be resistance. The idea that a single man, a judge no less, had the ability to determine the fate of so many without accountability should have been outrageous. But the truth was, people had accepted it for years. They had watched, they had whispered, but they had not fought back. Not until today. James had no illusions about what lay ahead. What happened in that courtroom would not be forgotten, but neither would it be enough. He had uncovered one case of corruption, but how many others had been buried? How many had been forced to accept the consequences of a rigged system, believing that no one would ever come to their defense? The weight of that realization settled deep in his bones. This could not end here. It would not. He had the power now, not just the badge, not just the title, but something stronger. He had seen the truth, and he had forced others to see it too. And that meant he had a responsibility. James Carter had never set out to be a symbol. He had only wanted the truth, only wanted fairness in a system that so often denied it. But now, he understood something he hadn't before. Change was not a request. It was a demand. And sometimes it took standing in the center of a broken system and refusing to let it go unchecked. Judge Calloway had believed himself untouchable, but today proved that no one was above justice. James would make sure of that, because the fight wasn't just his anymore. It belonged to everyone who had ever been silenced, and as long as he had a voice, he would use it. The battle was just beginning. Justice is not a given, it is a battle. A fight not only against those who abuse their power, but against complacency, against the silent acceptance of injustice. The fall of Judge Calloway was more than just the removal of a corrupt man. It was proof that truth, when wielded with courage, has the power to shake even the strongest foundations. It was a reminder that the system, no matter how deeply flawed, is not untouchable. But most importantly, it was a call to action for every person who has ever doubted whether their voice could make a difference. Because it can. It must. James Carter did not enter that courtroom expecting to become a symbol. He was not looking for glory. He was looking for justice. Not just for himself, but for every person who had been silenced. Every case that had been dismissed before it even had a chance to be heard. He proved that power is not in a title, a bench, or a robe. Power is in truth. And when truth is spoken without fear, it has the strength to break even the most deeply ingrained corruption. But if this story teaches us anything, it is that justice is never the end of the road. It is the beginning of something greater. One corrupt judge removed does not fix a broken system. One victory does not erase the damage inflicted over years of unchecked authority. The fight cannot stop at exposing one man. It must continue in courtrooms across the country, in the streets, in policy changes, in the unwavering demand for accountability. Because for every Calloway who falls, there are others who remain. Others who believe that power entitles them to rewrite the rules in their favor. Others who assume that people will continue to turn a blind eye, to stay silent, to accept that this is just the way things are. But that is not how change happens. Change happens when people stand up, when they refuse to look away, when they challenge injustice wherever it hides. It happens when we stop believing that fairness is a privilege given to some and not a right owed to all. It happens when we decide, collectively, that silence is no longer an option. So now the question is, what will you do? Will you let this story be just that, a story, a moment of outrage that fades with time? Or will you carry its message forward, Will you use your voice to demand more, to question, to hold those in power accountable? Because history does not change on its own. It is shaped by those who refuse to accept the world as it is and dare to fight for what it should be. If you believe in justice, if you believe in truth, if you believe in the power of standing up even when it feels impossible, then this is your fight too. And we are here to fight it together. Subscribe to Civil Rights Fight and be part of a movement that refuses to back down. A movement that will not rest until justice is not just a hope, but a reality, because justice is not given, it is won. And together, we will win it.